Hi there. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to some of the physical characteristics that are important in influencing the life in aquatic environments. So we're talking streams, rivers, lakes, and even the ocean. Now, before I jump in, I want you to think about this concept of stratification, or look for stratification as we go through. That is, in a single environment, there are many layers at which organisms will experience different phenomena. For example, at the top of the water, at the top of the ocean versus the bottom of the ocean, it's going to be very different indeed. Same thing on land, all the way down on the forest floor versus at the top of the forest canopy, very different experiences, and therefore very different adaptations that the organisms need to have in order to successfully survive in those situations. So let's begin. One physical characteristic that is wildly important both on land and in the water is light. Now, light is not experienced the same way, again, depending on where you are in the water column and where you are in the forest. So let's start with talking about how light varies in terms of color when you're in the water. Light from the sun, a lot of it is reflected off, but a good deal of it is actually absorbed by the water and what is living within it. So a certain amount of light is going to penetrate through the water and diffuse deeper and deeper into the water. Suspended within the water column are particles, there are organisms, and these are either going to absorb or they are going to scatter the light. Water itself is going to absorb light, but not all wavelengths in exactly the same way. Let me direct your attention down here to the bottom right, where we can see two different graphs. Here we see a graph that is showing us different wavelengths of light. So here is the visible spectrum of light. And let's see, on the x-axis, we see depth, so going deeper and deeper into the water, and a lot of the graphs are designed in a largely the same way. And here, this is transmittance, so how much of this light is actually getting into these depths. And so what we can see is that the lowest energy colors, so the longest wavelengths, are actually absorbed the first. And so red light doesn't really penetrate very much at all. Okay, so it is absorbed by the water close to the surface. We see that orange light can get a little bit deeper, yellow light deeper than that, and the greens and the blues can penetrate the deepest of all. However, only about 10% of even blue light, which can penetrate the most, reaches below 100 meters. And so this is why when you get lower and lower into the water, it gets darker and darker. Okay, this graph over here, we can see the light 0 to 100% and the depth. And so at the top of the water, you have most of the light. And then as you get deeper and deeper, these different wavelengths of light are absorbed, and therefore only a little bit of light is getting below 100 meters. And so what does this mean for life? Well, the color patterns of organisms that are typically found at the top of the water column, at the surface, versus all the way down at the floor are very different. So let's just walk through this a little bit. As we go through this, you should be thinking of what would an aquatic organism want to look like in order to camouflage the most with their surroundings, right? These fish do not want to be eaten. And so what would help them to blend in the most? And so what you can see is at the surface, the very surface, most of the organisms are blue. And so if you think about it, at the surface of the water, the most predators aren't coming from below, they're actually coming from above. So think about the gulls, think about pelicans. So aerial animals swoop down and they can hunt from the surface of the water. And so if you are one of these very vulnerable organisms living up at the top, you want to camouflage with the blue water below, right? So if you're a bird, you're looking down, the water is blue, and so the most camouflaged organisms would also be blue. Now, more towards the middle of the water column here, we can see that fish are either are for the most part bluish on the top, and they're kind of silvery on the bottom. And so what's going on with that? Well, these guys are vulnerable to predators both from above as well as from below. And so if you're a bird, again, looking down, and the top of the fish is blue, it's going to blend in with the surrounding blue water. But if you are a larger fish from down here and you are looking up, the silvery underside is going to blend in with the air. Right? So the light coming from above, this silver is going to blend in pretty well. Right? So animals that live kind of in this part of the water column, generally blue on the top, silver on the bottom. Moving down even farther, this is really where that light penetration gets in. Remember that the red and the orange light is absorbed the first. And so red and orange light is not actually going to penetrate down to these levels in the water column. And so what you start to see as you get deeper and deeper is that animals take on a reddish appearance. Okay, so red, again, the light does not penetrate down this low, and so there is no red light being reflected, and so animals cannot see these red organisms. Right? So they are actually invisible lower down. And so that might seem really bizarre to you, right? Like, how is that even possible? It's bright red, right? So if you go scuba diving, right, what you would see, right, with your little spotlight is this, right? That is a red fish. How on earth would that be actually camouflaged in the surrounding environment? Well, remember that your spotlight is showing red light. And so a white light, which includes red. Okay, so the red would then be reflected off of this fish and you are able to see it. The camera is able to take a photograph of it. But in nature, the red light, again, is absorbed by the water. And so when you get down to 100 meters, there's no more red light to reflect off of these red fish. And so the fish would be completely camouflaged, completely invisible in an environment which is only lit by a teeny bit of blue light. And so this is just one way that the physical environment determines what organisms can live where, or ultimately, over time, has led to the evolution of these species to have these certain characteristics. Light also varies with depth in terms of penetration. So light attenuation is this concept where, or it's a basic property of light in which the light loses its intensity the farther it is from its source, or the farther it has to travel through matter, either through the air or in this case through the water. So of course water is absorbing and reflecting, and also whatever is suspended within that water. Turbidity, this term here, turbidity, is a term that is referring to how much particulate matter is suspended within the water column. And so, of course, that varies substantially. This is my dog, Teddy, and he is coming out of the water here in the Pine Barrens. So this is Evans Bridge. And so in the Pine Barrens, the water almost looks like tea. Right, so lots of tannins from the surrounding cedar trees, and that gives the water this very brown appearance. If you put your hand in the water, you can bring your hand down only a couple inches and then you can't even see your hand anymore. So very dark, albeit very clean water. On the other hand, this is Teddy in Connecticut, and we can see that the water is not very turbid, so very clear. We can see the rocks on the bottom. This is actually, fairly deep in here, but still we can see the bottom of the river. And so, again, penetration is going to vary based on what is suspended within the water column. The intensity of the light is going to vary with the depth of the water as well. And in fact, this is going to essentially divide deep bodies of water into multiple zones. And so what I have down here for you are diagrams of the marine environment. So this is the ocean, and lacustrine, so lake. Right, so here's lake, and here is the ocean. It works largely the same way. Ultimately, there is a portion at the top of the water column through which light is able to penetrate. And so this is called the photic zone, whether we're talking about lakes or we're talking about the ocean. And so this zone is where all of the photosynthetic magic happens, right? So this is where autotrophs, we're talking plants, we're talking algae, we're talking cyanobacteria, all of these different organisms are able to use the light to photosynthesize, right? Therefore, as we know, taking up carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen as a byproduct. Okay? And of course, these are at the base of the food chain. And so this, these autotrophs provide food for the other organisms living in this environment. Okay? Ultimately, as we know, if you get deeper enough, the light is no longer going to penetrate. It's no longer going to be intense. And of course, any light there is, it is blue light. And so deep to the photic zone is the aphotic zone. So A means not. So this is not where photosynthesis can take place. And so this area is populated exclusively by heterotrophs. So organisms that can't generate their own energy. They need to consume other organisms. And detritivores, so vor, like herbivore, carnivore, these eat. What do they eat? They eat detritus. And so detritus is essentially dead stuff. And so all of those autotrophs up here in the photic zone, when they die, they precipitate down and they are broken down by detritivores. Okay, so again, the water is broken into the photic zone where light can penetrate and the aphotic zone. In addition to light, the water column is going to be stratified according to temperature. That is, multiple layers, very different physical characteristics in the top versus the bottom, and even in between. Okay, so very basic diagram here. We can see once again increasing depth. So here is the surface of the water, here is deeper, 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 and two different graphs, temperature and density. Remember that warmer water, warmer air is always less dense, and so it is going to rise. Cold water is more dense, and so it is going to fall. Okay, so let's take a look at this temperature graph. Oops, sorry. What we can see here is that at the very top of the water column, the temperature of the water is the warmest. Right? So what's happening here, of course, is that the sunlight is warming the surface waters. There's a bit of wind, there's a little bit of wave, and so the water is going to be churned a little bit, but the wind and the waves can only get so deep, and so really only a certain depth of the water at the top is going to be warmed. Below this mixed layer, the temperatures are going to drop off rapidly. Right? So what you can see here is that deep to the water that is actually churned and mixed and the light can actually get to is something called a thermocline, so a very steep decrease in temperature. So a very steep decrease in temperature into this zone called the hypolimnion, which is where the cold water has descended. It is more dense. It is not heated up by the sun, and so it remains fairly cold. Now, of course, the deeper you get, it does get a little bit colder, but at this point, there's no light, there's no mixing. It's just kind of, consistent temperature. Okay, so once again, we can name these layers just like we did on the last slide. Epi means on top of, so this is the layer on the top, and the hypo is hypo less than or under, so the colder region underneath. And again, the thermocline is this really steep decline in temperature. So in places of the world that actually experience seasons, the thermocline is only present really during the summer. Okay, so what this graph is showing us and what we're going to walk through here is the water temperature at different times of year as well as at different depths. Again, this is the surface, this is deeper within the water. Okay, in the summer, we see this classic thermocline. Remember, the surface waters are the warmest, the epilimnion. Here is that steep thermocline, and then the deeper waters remain fairly cold. Okay, in the fall, of course, the air is getting much colder. There is less sun because the days are getting shorter. And so what we see is that this warmer water is going to cool off. And that cooler water is going to start to sink, right? It's denser. And so as the cooler water sinks, right, there's a little bit more churning, mixing, and soon the temperature is going to become fairly uniform. Okay, so no longer do we see this really steep thermocline. In the wintertime, the water at the surface is going to cool even more. Okay, so sometimes the water at the surface can actually be colder than the water farther down. Right, so this cooler or at the surface, right? Sometimes even ice can form. And cool thing about water is that ice, which is cold, is actually less dense than water. And so it is going to float, kind of insulating this warmer water down here. Right, and so this water down here is not frozen, and so this allows fish and other organisms to continue living, albeit at a lower activity rate than during the summer, but it allows them to keep living, to not be frozen solid, because this area is insulated by the ice. In the spring, once again, days are getting longer, air is getting warmer, and so the upper layers are going to warm up. Start to get a little bit mixing, gets warmer deeper and deeper down, and ultimately leading into summer when, again, this steep thermocline reappears. So this is kind of the pattern that you would see in any place that actually experiences seasons. So like South Jersey, the water column is going to have different temperature patterns depending on the time of year. However, in places that are cold all year round, like in polar environments, there is no thermocline, right, at all. Pretty much this is what you would experience, maybe this in the summertime, but in general, no thermocline. In tropical environments, where essentially it is warm all the time, there is a strong thermocline, right? So the summer is essentially what we experienced all year round, but there is less mixing, and so you would not get this kind of static temperature. Temperature in moving water. And so mostly what we've been looking at so far are lakes and oceans, but when the water is moving, it actually has different temperature patterns. And so what we can see here is a watershed. So all of the water from an area of land draining into one single source. We can see that there are lots of little streams that converge together until they ultimately form these larger bodies of water and drain into a bay, an ocean, a lake, something. And so the headwaters, right, what are called first order streams, these are essentially collecting runoff water from melting snow. They are collecting water from underground and therefore very cold aquifers, right? So very cold water. Also, these streams are moving really quickly, right? So they're not really just sitting there heating up from the sun. And frankly, most of the time, these streams are shaded by trees and rocks, etc. So the first order streams, the headwaters, are generally very cold. They are swiftly moving and they are shaded. But as these first order streams converge into what are called second order streams here in teal, and then third order streams where multiple second order streams come together, etc., essentially more and more water is accumulating. And so that does a couple things. First of all, the streams get wider, right? When a stream is wider, this means that more surface area is exposed to the sun. Okay, and so they are able to warm up a lot more. Also, when the stream gets wider, no longer can the trees shade over the entire stream. And so now the water in the middle is exposed to direct sunlight. Also, not only are the rivers getting wider, but they are getting deeper as well. And so now we have this situation where the top is getting really warm and the bottom is still it is still deep, it is still shaded. And so you start to see stratification just like you would in a lake, for example, in these higher order streams. Now, given that information, we can probably accept that this variation in temperature depends on kind of where you are in the stream. So this graphic is showing us the length of a stream. We can see it starts uphill and it flows down and ultimately meets with a larger river. We see that it's meeting with another first order stream and then a second order stream, etc., before joining the river. If you take the temperature along the stream, you see that there is considerable variation in temperature over the length of the stream. And so let's zoom in to see exactly what is happening. When do we see this really big spike in temperature? Headwaters, really cold, right? Continuing downstream, remains really cold, gets even colder yet. Here we see lots of shade. These streams are probably moving really quickly, not really building up lots of heat. Okay, another stream joins, right? Might get a little bit warmer because now there is more water, wider stream, etc. But then where the temperature really changes is here. And so what you can see is this is a beaver meadow, so completely natural phenomenon occurring here. The beavers have done a couple things. First of all, they have removed a lot of the shade, right? So they fall trees and they remove the shade. Also, they are slowing down the water. They are building dams, creating little lakes, right, or very slow moving water. And so both of those changes together have the ability to drastically change the physical environment, the temperature of the water. Okay. After the beaver meadow, again, the stream is going to move a lot more quickly. It is back in the shade, and so it returns to this very cool condition. Okay, so again, depending on where you are in the river, depending on how much water, how much it's moving, how much shade, etc., that is going to determine the temperature of the water. And so we can also think about human interaction with waterways, deforestation, right? So if these trees were removed, okay, that would ultimately leave the waters exposed to the sun and increase the temperature, right? Mining activities, right? And any type of what is called thermal pollution, so industrial effluent, so waters taken from the river, used to cool engines as they are manufacturing paper or whatever, and then released back into the river farther downstream, only this time they're really warm waters. Runoff from parking lots, of course, that water is really hot in comparison to what it is coming out of the sky. And so any type of human activity that is directly increasing the water temperature. And so what's the big deal about temperature? Right, we love warmer water, right? Well, temperature influences many other both biotic, living, and abiotic factors. In this lesson, we're just focusing on the abiotic factors and just starting to think about how they might affect different organisms. And so we can see on this graphic is that temperature really is at the core of all of these different factors. So temperature is going to determine how much salt can dissolve in the water. It's going to determine how much CO2 and oxygen can dissolve in the water. It can influence pH and toxicity. And where I want to start first is talking about metabolic rate and photosynthesis. Okay, so we'll talk about a couple of these as we go along. So temperature is going to affect the living organisms within the water by essentially changing the metabolic rate within the animals or plants or anything. So these temperature is directly going to influence how many enzymes are active and how active they are. As we can see, as temperature increases, metabolic rate is also going to increase. And so this is really behind why we get a fever when we're fighting a cold or we're fighting an infection. We get a fever so that we increase the activity of our own enzymes, and therefore we can combat whatever is invading our body, right? So fevers, not a bad thing, very helpful. And so enzymes are more active when temperature increases. For most fish, about a 10 degrees Celsius increase in temperature is literally going to double the rate of physiological function, right? Seems like a great idea, right? The cost of this is increased oxygen consumption, right? So in areas that are limited in terms of oxygen, this can really this can really seriously affect organisms that are all competing for a very limited resource. On the other hand, if temperature gets too high, so it gets too high over here, then those same enzymes which were ramped up are going to denature. They're going to unravel and no longer be functional. And so this curve here should maybe seem kind of familiar. This almost looks like a zone of tolerance, right? So this particular organism, my hypothetical organism, can only really function in, this range right here of temperatures, and not in this range, and not really in this range. Right? So zone of tolerance. And so for some examples here are several different species of fish. And what we can see is a lot of different temperatures. So maximum weekly temperature for growth, right? Maximum temperature for survival, average temperature, and maximum temperature for spawning. And so what we can see without looking at the actual numbers is that there are maximum temperatures, right, at which these organisms can grow, that they can survive, that they can reproduce. Any higher than these temperatures, their enzymes start to break down. And so fish, luckily for them, do have the ability to move. And so a lot of these guys have actually developed this behavior to actually move to warmer or cooler water during different events in their life cycle. So they might go upstream to spawn where it's cooler, or they might go downstream to spawn when it's cooler, or vice versa. Okay. Similar to animals, plants experience the same type of zones of tolerance in terms of temperature. So what we can see on this graph is temperature, photosynthesis, and 4 different species. And so just in general, I want to point out that each species has a slightly different zone of tolerance, right? They have optimal photosynthesis at this particular temperature, right? These particular temperatures, this temperature, and on either side of that, too low or too high, they start to lose their efficiency. So temperature and variations in temperature are very important in determining the activity of both autotrophs and heterotrophs. Oxygen, another physical factor determining or influencing life in the water column. What we can see here is oxygen diffusing into water in a river. And so oxygen diffuses in, and plants and algae also produce oxygen when they photosynthesize. Okay, so oxygen content in the water, about 20% of that is from air, and about 1% is from the water. Okay, as you get lower and lower, oxygen levels are going to decrease, right? Because, right, 20% of that oxygen is actually coming from the air. As you get deeper, again, respiration is going to be occurring, right? So heterotrophs and even plants and algae who need to, of course, use some of that oxygen to complete cellular respiration, oxygen is going to be used up the farther and farther away from the surface that you get. Okay? So this graph down here is once again showing us depth in the water column. On the x-axis is amount of oxygen. And so you can see there's lots of oxygen up here at the surface, and then it declines as you get deeper and deeper. Again, shift from photosynthesis to respiration dominant areas, organisms. But then after you reach about 1,000 meters deep, essentially the oxygen levels are going to increase once again, and this has nothing to do with photosynthesis and everything to do with colder water having more oxygen within it. Okay. So dissolved oxygen is generally higher in flowing water versus versus stagnant water. So a lake versus a river. Think about how a river is like running over rocks. And so there's a lot more mixing of water from the air into the water. Okay. Solubility of oxygen, again, is a function of some other physical factors, including, of course, temperature. As we can see in this graph, temperature and dissolved oxygen are inversely proportional. And so let me just walk through this. This is actually in New Jersey. January through December, of course, these months in the middle here are warmer than the winter months over here. And so as we might imagine, the water temperature is cold in the winter, much warmer in the summer, and colder again in the winter. And what we can also see is that dissolved oxygen is lowest in the summer and highest in the winter. So when temperature is low, dissolved oxygen is high. When temperature is high, dissolved oxygen is lower. And so once again, this is another way that temperature affects other physical characteristics within the water. Okay. Dissolved oxygen is also influenced by salinity. Okay, so with more salinity, there is less oxygen. Okay, so same relationship as temperature and pressure. So the higher the atmospheric pressure, the more oxygen is going to be dissolved. Dissolved oxygen, as suggested by the last graph, can vary in terms of temperature, or can vary because of variations in temperature. Because of that, dissolved oxygen can be stratified in lakes and ponds, particularly during the summer. So once again, we have these graphs, temperature and oxygen, and we are seeing all 4 seasons. In the summer, remember, the temperatures are the highest, closest to the surface. Here's a thermocline, and then they are lower, much deeper. And so dissolved oxygen is going to vary as well. Okay, so different temperature is highest here. And so we have the lowest dissolved oxygen compared to the cooler seasons in the summer. In the winter, there's actually a lot more dissolved oxygen. And so remember that, coldest water in the winter, and so the highest dissolved oxygen. Furthermore, if there is ice that forms on the surface of the water, the ice actually further prevents any loss of oxygen to the atmosphere, keeping it within the water column for the organisms within it. Okay. During the winter, there's also a lower demand for oxygen by the organisms, many of which are going to be ectothermic, so they are not generating their own heat. They can kind of reduce their activity levels and therefore not respire as much, not need as much oxygen to get through the colder winter months. Okay. And of course, spring and summer are kind of transitional times, when water is warming or cooling and therefore is recharged or loses some of that dissolved oxygen. Okay. For fish, there is, of course, a zone or a range of tolerance for dissolved oxygen. Of course, oxygen is critical in fish in that they need it for cellular respiration, that is, to generate ATP, and therefore to do all of the things they need to do, to move, to reproduce, etc. And so here we see a range for fish. Anything too low, fish cannot survive. Okay. High is good, right? So anything greater than 9 parts per million supports fish populations. And as you get lower and lower oxygen, you get lower and lower activity levels, and of course, stressful conditions for the fish. And zone or range of tolerance, very important in predicting what organisms can actually survive. I'd like to take a moment to talk about fish kills or dead zones. this is something that you may have heard of on the news before. It's maybe something that you've seen before. So I want to just explain how levels of dissolved oxygen and their decline, particularly in the summer months, can lead to these massive fish kills that you have seen. So first and foremost, hypoxia, like hypo, again, less than oxia, less than the adequate oxygen needed to sustain a fish population. Okay. So how exactly does hypoxia happen, and how does this lead to fish kills? In the summertime, in particular, excess nutrients are released into our waterways via runoff from fertilizing your lawn, runoff from agricultural activities, also sewage effluent, both, like sometimes they like close down the beaches because there's too much E. coli, and so that's indicating sewage. Essentially, what all these have in common is that they are adding excess nutrients to our waterways. And so usually these nutrients, such as nitrogen, are limiting. And so when all of a sudden there is an overabundance of these nutrients in the water, this is going to cause a boom in phytoplankton. So phyto, plant or photosynthesizer, plankton, so microorganisms that photosynthesize. Okay, so now all of a sudden they have everything that they need, and they are going to go forth and multiply. And so usually the first sign of excess nutrients is an algal bloom. This is also called eutrophication. Again, this overabundance of photosynthesizers, particularly algae, within our polluted waterways. At first, this is great in terms of dissolved oxygen, right? So these organisms are photosynthesizing like crazy, pumping out lots of dissolved oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. However, the surface, right, the epilymnion, which we talked about before, is warm. And remember that warm water releases dissolved oxygen, has a lower dissolved oxygen content. So as soon as the phytoplankton generate this oxygen, the dissolved oxygen is going to leave the water. Okay? These phytoplankton and other algae do not have a very long lifespan, and so shortly they are going to die off at the end of their natural life. And just as we discussed before, they are going to precipitate out of water and end up on the floor. Right, so there is where all of these detritivores, right, eating dead stuff, in this case, eating that dead algae, and they are going to eat them up using dissolved oxygen in the process. Okay? So as these organisms use up all the oxygen, it leaves the water hypoxic, so less oxygen than is required for fish. Right? Remember on the last slide, we saw that fish can only successfully live within fairly oxygen-rich water. And so if that oxygen is being taken away by detritivores because of the preceding phytoplankton boom, the fish are going to die off. And again, this is especially problematic in the summer because of that hotter epilymnion is going to release more of that oxygen, and more people are fertilizing their lawns in the summertime. And so very predictably every summer there is a massive dead zone, right? So a hypoxic area in which fish are not able to live, and maybe even some of these other organisms are not able to live as well. And so this is found within the Gulf of Mexico, which you'll read about shortly. And so what we can see here is the entire watershed of the Mississippi and Atchafalaya rivers. All of these areas are agricultural, so lots of fertilizer being dumped onto this land and washing away into the rivers. Cities, right, huge human population, so lots of sewage, lots of again, fertilizer and other human activities washing away into these rivers and dumping out right here into the Gulf of Mexico. And so this adds a huge amount of excess nutrients, again, leading to eutrophication and subsequently a die-off of organisms. Okay, so stay tuned. We will talk about that more shortly. Other physical characteristics. Water acts as a solvent, and so it is able to dissolve different types of ionic compounds, including lots of salts. Ocean salinity on average is about 35%. Other minerals are also dissolved in water, and so the concentration of these different compounds can determine who can live there and what the environment kind of looks like. One example here is calcium carbonate. When water is flowing through limestone or flowing over limestone rocks, it can actually dissolve the limestone, releasing the calcium carbonate within it. And so waters that have high calcium that have high calcium carbonate ultimately end up with a lot of bicarbonate. And so this is going to change the pH of the water, and at maximum solubility, which is what's going on here, the calcium carbonate actually starts to precipitate out of the water and form sediments. And so what you can see here is the water flowing over the rocks, and on either side of this little stream, you can see that there is this crusty buildup. So actually rocks forming from previously eroded limestone. Okay, pH in aquatic environments. Just as a reminder, pH is on a scale from 1 to 14, neutral being 7 here. And so what this graphic is showing us is just essentially the hinting at the zones of tolerance for different organisms, and also the pH of something like acid rain. So acid rain caused by pollutants in the air, making the rain more acidic, and that is in this range here, like 1 to 4. Normal precipitation maybe around 5 to 6. Humans can be in a fairly large range of pHs in aquatic environments before their metabolism and enzymes start to go haywire, start to break down. But of course, we don't spend that much time in the water. So fish, for example, have a lot narrower range of pHs in which they can thrive. Anything too high or too low can kill fish off. Okay, plants for the most part thrive in a more basic environment before, again, their enzymes start to denature. pH is also important in influencing survivability because it influences the solubility of different nutrients. Okay, so making nutrients available for plants, for example, right, too acidic, that means that plants actually can't take up the nutrients that they need out of the soil. Heavy metals are also dissolved in different pHs, and so generally a lower pH means that heavy metals are going to be more available in the environment and therefore more damaging to organisms living within it. Susceptibility to fungal infections, actually. Generally in a lower, in pHs that are too high or too low, animals can become stressed and therefore can become more susceptible to infection. Of course, physical damage, right? Really acidic or even really basic environments can actually irritate skin and therefore stress out the organism. What I think is fascinating is that different frequencies of sound, particularly those that are used by different marine mammals for communication, they are going to propagate actually better in waters that have a lower pH. And so many different factors are impacted by the pH in aquatic environments. And so let's talk a little bit more about pH. It's very complicated. Many different factors influence pH, and so I just want to focus on one, and that is the relationship between carbon dioxide and pH. And so naturally in the environment, carbon dioxide, of course, exists in the air, okay? As a result, dissolves in the water. Okay, so carbon dioxide, just like oxygen, dissolves in water. When CO2 is within the water, it naturally forms carbonic acid. Right? Carbonic acid is a relatively unstable acid, and so it immediately breaks down into hydrogen ions, therefore low pH acid, and carbonate. Okay, so generally, the more carbon dioxide there is dissolved in the water, the lower the pH is going to be. Okay, so think hydrogen ions, acid, low pH. More CO2, more acidic. Okay, generally, these hydrogen ions are bound up by, or buffered, bound up by carbonate, right, forming bicarbonate. Okay, so just generally keeping the pH of the ocean and any water relatively consistent. Dissolved carbon dioxide, again, lowers pH. Okay, so here we can see a pH scale. Here we can see total carbon dioxide. And so more CO2 is going to lower the pH. Okay. We can also see that closer to the surface versus farther down in the water column, the pH is going to change as well. So more acidic, lower, and more basic, higher. And so more CO2 means more acidic, right? Lower pH, more hydrogen, more acidic. And so what happens when there is additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? When there is a higher carbon dioxide pressure, right, so more CO2 in the air, this means that more CO2 is going to dissolve in the water. Okay? As always, more CO2 produces more of this very unstable carbonic acid, which immediately dissociates into the things that we just talked about. The problem here that we have seen with this age of industrialization, right, which of course pumps out more CO2 into the atmosphere, therefore more into our oceans, is that when carbonate is busy buffering these additional hydrogen ions, right? So much CO2, so carbonate is busy here making bicarbonate instead of doing what it usually does when there's less CO2 in the atmosphere. So what carbonate usually does is it is taken up by invertebrates within the ocean, so shelled animals, combined with calcium to form calcium carbonate, so to form this major component of the shells of these animals. And so once again, more industrialization, more pumping out pollution into the atmosphere, means more CO2. More CO2 means less carbonate available to be used in the shells of different organisms. And so what we have seen over time is that shells of these animals have softened, therefore making them more vulnerable to predators. We have seen coral reefs, right, soften as well. We're also using calcium carbonate. And so they die off as well, which of course is, they usually serve as a habitat for so many other organisms. And so if the corals start to die off, then other animals lose their habitat, they lose their protection, lose food even. And so the entire ecosystem is impacted by additional carbon dioxide. And that is not even considering the pH changes, right? So the lower pH, right, maybe shifting outside of that zone of tolerance, making more heavy metals available, right, and so many other things. Okay, so let's look at some data here. This graph is showing us just the relationship of carbon dioxide, bicarbonate, and carbonate. And so usually the ocean's pH is over here, so relatively basic. And the ocean in the past 100 years or so has declined about 0.1 pH units, which, you know, that sounds like no big deal. It sounds like nothing, but what this actually amounts to is about a 30% increase in acidity. So shifting the pH in this direction. And so if we take a look here, what we can see is a shift in this direction is going to, is associated with an increase in carbon dioxide, right? So that's what's driving this in the first place, and a decrease in carbonate, right? So an increase in CO2 is associated with a decrease in carbonate, right? Because bicarbonate is buffering this pH. Okay, so a decrease in carbonate, and therefore, as I just said, a softening of shells within the ocean. And so we have seen this, we have recorded data that supports this. So this is measurements taken in Hawaii. This is atmospheric carbon dioxide as measured here, right, as measured on the island. The seawater carbon dioxide has increased in parallel, right? So same slope, the more CO2 in the air means the more CO2 in the water. And at the same time, you get this decrease in pH. And again, a decrease in pH is going to reduce how much carbonate is available for shells, for coral, for other exoskeletons of other invertebrates. And so we can see that this change has happened just within the past couple decades, right? It is predicted by the International Panel on Climate Change that there will be a 0.3 to 0.4 decrease in pH by 2100. So within the next 80 years, easily within your lifetime, this trend can increase even more, or can continue even more. And again, each 0.1 pH units is like a 30% increase in acidity. Okay, so going back to this image right here, temperature, pH, CO2, dissolved oxygen, metabolic rate, and photosynthesis, all of these are intimately intertwined. Each is going to affect the other. Furthermore, temperature, as temperatures increase, they are going to increase the solubility of different compounds, and thus the toxicity of these compounds. So for example, heavy metals like cadmium, zinc, and lead are more soluble in water when the temperature is higher, and therefore more biologically available to organisms. With each 10-degree increase in temperature, ammonium levels are going to double, or the ammonia to ammonium ratio is going to double. And remember that when temperature changes, so too does enzyme activity. And so animals, organisms, tolerance to these different compounds is going to be different at different temperatures as well. Generally, when temperatures are higher, tissues are more permeable. So not only are more heavy metals and other compounds more available in the water, but also tissues are going to take those in even faster. Metabolic rate and oxygen consumption is going to increase, and therefore they are going to use these and be affected by them a lot more quickly. Okay, so thank you everybody for watching this video. Here is the study guide for chapters 3 and the appropriate portions of chapter 24 on aquatic environments. Remember, maybe start to study with just walking through these different terms, these different learning outcomes, and go from there with practice questions. Once again, thank you so much. Look forward to our next time together. Thanks.